Now, as we've been recapping with our reporter, the former president has until the end of today to file his papers for a permanent stay of prosecution in his corruption trial. We understand his legal team is in the process of doing just that. Zuma's co-accused French arms company Thales has already filed its papers. The legal team of the former president wanting the charges dropped, citing several flaws in the case, they say. The former president, as we've been reporting, not seeming phased. He's out on the election campaign trail there in Pinetown. That's where he was earlier this morning. He is now in KwaMashu, where he's meant to address that group of people that are there who are waiting to hear from the former president. Our reporter telling us he's expecting the former president to stick to the script, to talk about the importance of voting for the ANC in next year's all-important national elections, elections 2019. Very interestingly, in terms of the state capture inquiry itself, for the first time, many would say this week, Barbara Hogan, the former Public Enterprises Minister, who served under Zuma and under his administration, putting him really at the center of meddling in state-owned entities. The former president, in fact, not yet applying to cross-examine any witnesses. But let's take you back to that story around the French arms company filing papers, Thales filing papers to have a permanent stay of prosecution. Let's take you live now to Henny van Vieren. He is the author of or rather he is from the Open Secrets Research Organization, and he joins us from our studios in Cape Town. Henny, thanks very much for taking the time to join us and to be a part of our show. Just take us through your thoughts with regard to what Thales is saying in its court papers regarding its application for a permanent stay of prosecution.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle. I mean, I think quite extraordinary. We see Thales today file papers. Pardon me. We see Thales file papers today in an extraordinary manner, and I think it's an indication of an attempt once again by Thales to try and delay the process. It's something that they have been involved in throughout, and it's this delay which they argue that they are the victim of, effectively that they call for delay of the prosecution because they say they've been prejudiced by the actions of the state, is the result of their own actions over a very lengthy period of time. If we look over the last 10 to 15 years, every attempt to delay this process of prosecution of the French arms company Thales and President Jacob Zuma has really been the result of actions by Thales, both legally and politically, and Jacob Zuma to try and put a stop to this.
I mean, Henny, if you are still able to hear us, I see you've taken your earpiece out, but if you are able to hear us, what would be the implications of this permanent stay of prosecution being granted?
Yeah, so I think that the implication, if it were to be granted, of course, is that this would take Thales effectively out of the witness box. And what Thales would be doing is what they've tried to do all along, is open the way to ensure that Jacob Zuma himself is not being prosecuted. And if I may, Michelle, just to step back for a moment when we look at the case in its entirety. Thales has interfered in different ways to ensure that they weren't prosecuted. When we think about the evidence that we heard from the People's Tribunal earlier this year from a former Thales official, Mr. A.J. Suklal, who was receiving money from Thales, it was quite clear that there was an attempt by Thales to bribe former Justice Minister Penyul Maduna, and the effect of that was that Thales was never prosecuted with Mr. Shabir Sheikh, something which they refer to in their papers that they should have been prosecuted years ago if the state really wanted this to happen. What we also know is that from one of the Thales officials, Mr. Pierre Moineau, is that Thales, the French arms company, again went about ensuring that various people were paid to assist Mr. Zuma in his attempt to ensure that he wasn't prosecuted in the period 2006, 7, 8, in that period. And thirdly, we've also heard evidence this year that the two French presidents leaned on the South African presidents to call on Thales not to be prosecuted. And so what we see, and finally to say, is that what Thales has done here is they haven't gone to the same court that is going to hear Mr. Zuma's case, but instead they've chosen to go to the High Court court. Effectively, what they're doing here is they're going to delay Mr. Jacob Zuma's trial and Talas's trial itself, to draw this out as far as possible and ensure that they are not prosecuted. And again, I stress this because I think what we're seeing is a corporation that argues that it's the victim. But if anything, they are part of the conspiracy to ensure that justice delayed and denied in this incredibly important case for all South Africans.
Henny, in terms of one part of the argument of Thales, in that the prosecution has not followed its own protocols, the way that the NPA has been undermined, let's say, over the past decade, and the shell of the organization that was operating over that decade, surely that must also play a massive role in where we've come to in the case today.
Absolutely. I think if one had to look at a real factual matrix, from a legal argument, if the lawyers had to sit down and say, let's take all factors into account, Thales, you yourself claim that you're a victim of some of the delays, but certainly those delays, there have been a number of things that took place in the interim. We know about the many challenges within the NPA itself. Many of those were as a result of interference by Jacob Zuma, precisely because he didn't want to be prosecuted for corruption, and I assume he didn't want Thales to be prosecuted for bribery either. So the destabilization of the country's national prosecuting authority goes back to the doorstep of corporations like Thales and Mr. Zuma. And of course, we've seen the Seriti Commission of Inquiry, that cover-up that took place, that sham commission over a number of years, was another example of precisely this. And if, Michelle, if I can add, of course, Thales was more than happy to appear before the Seriti Commission of Inquiry. They, in fact, sent the same person in whose name these papers are to spend a day in front of the Seriti Commission of Inquiry, but they make no reference to that. So they are more than happy to participate in legal processes where they, I assume, know what the outcome is going to be, and they know that the cards are stacked in their favor. Here we have the potential of a rigorous, independent prosecution taking place, and the lawyers for Thales, the advocates for Thales, are trying again to construct a false argument intended to protect this corporation that seems to argue that it should not be held to account for its alleged crimes. So,
Henny, the point we're at today is where the former president may well escape prosecution. I mean, this is in connection to 783 questionable payments that he received in connection with that 1999 arms deal. So he may well walk away scot-free.
I don't think so. The final word hasn't been written on this yet, Michelle. I think the crucial point is here. We need to be asking of the National Prosecuting Authority, are you working and are you going to be working all weekend in drafting papers? You need to not come with another case, which we saw in the state capture cases, that truly are wishy-washy in their argumentation. They have the evidence, being the National Prosecuting Authority. There is still a certain amount of institutional knowledge, despite all the havoc that Mr. Zuma, that corporations like Thales and others have effectively allowed to take place in the destabilization of the NPA. I think that there is strong good reason for them to go back to court and to ensure that, bring the court's attention to the facts, I think, that we've discussed now, and argue that this is a flimsy, weak argument by a corporation that has used precisely the same strategy. We shouldn't forget, in the pits of Stalingrad was not only Mr. Zuma, but have been corporations like Thales and others who have been fighting hard to avoid accountability. So I think certainly the last word isn't written on this, but crucially, they have, and I think we as South Africans should recognize, we know from where we're sitting that a new National Director of Public Prosecutions has not yet been appointed. There's a great amount of instability across that institution. The intention and the decision to come forward with this request to have those charges dropped at this point, I think, is to aim at the weak spot of the NPA. The NPA, the prosecutors of the NPA need to draw together, and they need to ensure that that justice is seen to be done. This is, I think, a test case for the integrity of the NPA and our faith in the institution to both protect the vulnerable but ensure that the powerful are held to account.
Yeah, the irony of the fact that these interviews are taking place for a new NDPP today is the last day of those interviews in the wake of Thales filing these papers today as well. Henny, if worst case scenario, the NPA doesn't, as you say, sit down over the weekend bring together all of the information and the evidence that it has around this case. What kind of steps do we have as civil society that might be available to us?
Yeah, I do think that civil society organizations need to think strongly in helping to make the arguments if the NPA isn't able to do so. And I think that there is recourse that certainly is available via the courts. The matter is set down, or is to be heard, from what I understand, in February of next year. We need to wait and see what Mr. Zuma has to do, his plans to do, rather. But, very clearly, I think that we, and I speak from a corner of civil society, but I think as people in South Africa must stop looking at this case as merely a case of Jacob Zuma versus the public. I think why where Talis positions itself is incredibly important. It shows that this corrupt arms deal of the late 1990s was part of a global system of corruption. What we are doing in South Africa is we are not only fighting for accountability in our country for the fact that money wasn't spent on where it was most needed amongst the country's poor, but went into the pockets of the rich and into the pockets of these global corporations and their politicians. But it's also to send a message globally that these corporations cannot simply buy their way out, fight their way out legally and never be held to account. So I think there is much work that needs to be done. This fight is far from over.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to us. Henny van Vuuren is from research organisation Open Secrets, joining us from our Cape Town studios. We do now have confirmation, in fact, from the KZN Director of Public Prosecutions. That was confirmed by our reporter a short while ago, Spamandla Gorge. Former President Jacob Zuma's legal team is filing those papers as we speak.